Hi guys, so I just wanted to make a quick video on 10 easy ways to get better at debating. I know that very often when it comes to coaching, we are always doing as coaches, maybe you sometimes feel high level stuff. And what I've seen in the years that I've been coaching, as well as my own personal debating journey, very many of the things that you need to do in order to get better. I would say about 80% of your improvement lies in these 10 things. And I would say, even for myself, how well I do at a tournament, how well I do in a specific debate, wherever, is I would say about 80% to 90% determined by whether or not I follow these basic rules. And I will tell you that where I've lost debates, sometimes it is just that you have very, very good opponents and they were the better team on the day. But I would definitely say at least 60 to 70% of the times I lose debates, it has to do with me not doing some of these things. And the times where I've won debates or done exceptionally well, gotten a very high speaker score, it's always where I've done all of these things. So the first thing you can do to get better at debating is to speak slower. It seems like a very obvious thing. The amount of kids that I coach and the amount of debaters in university that go years and years and years debating, trying to consume all sorts of other debating resources and content and get better in so many different ways. But they speak so quickly and in a way that is so hard to follow that it's difficult even for them oftentimes to know what kind of speech they're delivering. And so often when I hear people give arguments, it's like they don't understand that they have a full 7 or 8 minutes. And much of the time when I'm adjudicating debates as well, when you're judging people that speak very, very quickly, it is so rarely the case that they have so much to get through. It's usually them repeating themselves or them, stuttering and not enunciating words properly. And I can definitely relate to this. I would say naturally I'm a very, very quick talker, I'm a very, very quick writer. And this was one of the number one things I had to really practice and get better at when it came to debating. And I can tell you that once I fixed just this, honestly, just speaking more slowly and being more careful and more enunciated with my points and my ideas and more clear with them, I just saw my speaker scores go up by so much. I found myself being able to really not lose unnecessarily in many, many debates. And even in debates where I was against very good teams, the times where I felt like I did really well were usually the times where I felt like I was at least speaking slower and I was owning the podium and I was letting everyone know that I knew what I was trying to get across and the judges could take it down very carefully. The second thing I would say you can do, if I can get this slideshow to work, is write notes that you can actually use. Now, this seems very obvious, but the amount of times I watch kids, university speakers debate, hell, even myself, where I can tell you're not even really using your notes because you can't even tell what you wrote there. They're disorganized. Halfway through the speech, you're just freestyling what you think the argument was. It's really important that you find a note taking style and a note making style that works for you. What I've generally found is to make sure that I write out the core ideas I want to get across and number them very, very clearly on a page and make sure that I'm very clear to the edge as I'm going through each specific point, whether that be in rebuttal or in argumentation. And that just makes sure that you're actually progressing your argument, because sometimes you write so much, and I do this all the time as well. You write so much, and by the end of your speech, you haven't said 40% of what you wanted to say. So make sure that as you're debating, you start trying to get better at writing the notes that you have, writing more efficiently, not writing a whole bunch of stuff and then when you get to the podium it's impossible to use because it's either terrible handwriting or it's just so much information that your brain can't process it. What I would rather advise you do is write down fewer things, listen more carefully, and make sure that when you see that specific bullet point and slight explanation on your page, you immediately understand what it's reminding you of. But in general, the ideas and the arguments should be in your head, and what you write down should just be a way for you to logically follow your own logic. The third thing I would say is prioritize your rebuttal, especially when you're opposition first speaker, especially when you're third speaker. The amount of times I see speakers spend 2 or 3 minutes of their speech beating to death a point that, one, they don't even rebut all that well, but two, even if they annihilate it and wipe it off the map, it isn't close to being the most important argument from the other team. And then you'll see them towards the end of their speech say, oh yeah, by the way, they said this, we have a few responses. And then they lose the debate. So it's so important when you're debating, really crucial, you only have 7 or 8 minutes. And of that 7 or 8 minutes, maybe 2 or 3, depending on your speaker role, are being spent on rebuttal. So what I always do with my rebuttal is I take notes very efficiently and very quickly. So as I'm writing down my rebuttal, somewhere I find the time to rewrite it in descending order of importance. If you can't do that, I would at least advise you to use something like a highlighter or use something like a numbering system, so that after you've written down your rebuttal, and again, don't write too much, you can number them and have some kind of color code scheme or something to guide you to make sure that you're addressing the most important things first and not later. And this seems like such a small thing, but it is really, really a big deal, because so much of the strategy of a team and how good the strategy of a team is, especially when you're going up against really good teams, has so much to do with the way you prioritize your time. And not just prioritizing your rebuttal, but making sure that, your opposition first. Don't spend 6 minutes on rebuttal. Even if the P1 was really good, maybe you also want to give the judge your case and not just tell the judge why they were wrong. The other thing is, and again, this seems so simple and so stupid, and if you're watching this, you're probably thinking, why are you telling me all these useless things? But the amount of times I'm in high-level rooms, even for myself, and people just get lost in the sauce. They start rebutting an argument, you don't know where the rebuttal started, where it ended, what exactly the main points of contention were. If someone has said something, ask yourself how many different ways you can rebut that thing, and then number them, and then tell the judge explicitly, they said this thing, briefly and fairly describe what their argument was, and tell them, we have 1 response, 2 responses, 4 responses, right? And then you say, my first response is this, deliver the response. My second response is this, deliver the response, and so on. And that allows the judge, when they're adjudicating you, to say, oh, I know exactly what their response was. It was these 4 key distinct things. When you're just saying it all in one go, so often what happens is judges, they might be tired, or they might not be the best note takers, but you'll hear in deliberation that they said, oh, you kind of said this, but this wasn't really enough to defeat the argument. And you're sitting there thinking, but I didn't just say that, I also said this and this and this. Maybe the judge missed it. Maybe you weren't clear enough about how you were differentiating between the different unique points of rebuttal that you were giving. And yes, you can be mad at the judge, but it's also largely your fault for not being clear enough. So this really seems incredibly basic, but I coach people that have been debating for the provincial team, and in many cases even trialed for maybe the national team, or many very high-level university debaters or not so high-level university debaters that have been doing it for a while, and they just will not number their rebuttal. And it is such a small thing that you could do that could just make you so much more persuasive and ensure that you use your time much more effectively. Again, this seems like this really, really basic thing, like it's the first thing you teach to someone who's debating in grade 8. But honestly, in my opinion, the biggest difference I've seen, either in myself and the quality of my own speeches, and how, I guess you can call it, scared I am to debate against other debaters, the one type of debate I really don't like going up against, or the one type of debate I know is going to be hard to beat, is someone who's very clear and will tell you explicitly what the different reasons are for supporting their arguments. It's not just them saying, oh, I have 3 layers of analysis for the sake of saying it. They actually have 3 different ways that they get a specific outcome. And they tell you in these 3 ways and for these 3 distinct reasons. And oftentimes a lot of debaters get confused because they say, I don't want to overemphasize something, but I also don't want to be inefficient in my speech. And there's a very simple solution to that. When you have a specific bit of analysis under your argument, number that specific bit of analysis. But I promise you, whatever argument you're trying to make, there are definitely multiple different ways of supporting it. And so try and write out the 1, 2, 3, 4 main bits of analysis that will convince the judge and the room at large that what you're saying is true, and then just develop them independently. But really hold yourself accountable to make sure that each bit of analysis is genuinely different. Now, I haven't prepared any examples off the top of my head, but let's say you're making this really basic argument that lowering taxes is going to result in the economy growing. There's many different ways of saying that. You could say, firstly, if there's lower taxes, people have more money to spend, and so there's more money circulating in the economy. Maybe that's your one point, and you expand on that. Maybe the other thing you say is that when there's lower taxes, the economy is more attractive to foreign investment, so you're likely to get more foreign investors, and then you expand on that. But that's a separate point. Maybe the third one you say is, internally within the country, the pre-existing corporations that exist, when they have lower taxes, maybe now they have more money for capital investment or to expand businesses or to pay people more money. So I think I'm just trying to get across to you that when you're trying to make these arguments, oftentimes there are so many very intuitive, simple bits of analysis that are distinct and unique from each other that you can present and that you just don't do. You'll find one and find 10 different ways of presenting it. But at the end of the day, I'm sitting there as a judge and I know what I'm doing. And all you've really done is said one thing, but spent 5 minutes doing it. So what's really important about labeling your arguments and also numbering your unique bits of analysis is in prep, it keeps you accountable to make sure that you're developing your argumentation and you're not just taking one idea and beating it to death. The sixth thing, I think, and this is a very general point, I'm saying, do an even if, but I mean, when you're in debates, right, you might be in a debate where you feel like the other team hasn't been super fair when it comes to the context. You feel like you're spending all the time in the debate trying to convince the judge that a very specific thing you said is true. And oftentimes what makes for really robust cases is if you can tell the adjudicator why you win in multiple different contexts and in different situations where even if, you can say, we don't think what they're saying is true, even if it is true, we're still winning. And making that a habit in your rebuttal, in your argumentation, when you're contesting things like context, etc., that's a useful thing. So for example, maybe you're in a debate that's about feminists in conservative countries or in developing countries should rather attempt to reinterpret religion as opposed to directly oppose it, right? Something along those lines. And so generally speaking, proposition, when they describe or contextualize what a conservative or developing country looks like, it's obviously in their interests to think of the most rigid, highly religious, conservative areas where there's just a huge amount of backlash to situations in which you criticize religion, right? That would be maybe they spend the entire debate talking about Saudi Arabia and Afghanistan, even though obviously most developing countries have very, very different levels of religiosity, different political atmospheres when it comes to the critique of religion, etc., etc. Now, it's obviously very important for you to point that out and to tell the judge, listen, this isn't the only context in which this debate takes place. This debate actually takes place in a vast variety of contexts, and you explain why that's the case. But don't let all of your arguments hinge on the judge buying the fact that this is the specific context the debate is taking place. Because sometimes judges just don't do that. And what that means is it leaves your case very, very vulnerable. Because if you lose that one clash, the one clash on where the debate is actually taking place, then so much of your argumentation is going to be thrown out when it comes to deliberation if you end up losing that. So a good idea in that debate is to say, listen, even in Saudi Arabia, even in Afghanistan or wherever, why is it that feminists are more influential if they do X, Y, and Z. Maybe you make the argument that oftentimes, for example, women in these places structurally aren't able to access positions of religious authority, for example. And so their ability to do things like reinterpretations of religion in these hyper-conservative areas is quite limited. However, there is often in these places a relatively large counter-governmental political movement that is broadly secular, even in places like Afghanistan, even in places like Saudi Arabia. And so aligning themselves with those movements actually gives them more power. That's just off the top of my head. What I'm trying to tell you is, in debates, especially when it comes to context and like these core things that you think the other team is trying to assert unfairly, it's fine. Tell the judge that's not where the debate is taking place. But just always do that even if. You don't even need to win the even if. The judge might still say, in these super conservative places, yeah, we kind of buy props analysis a bit more. That's totally fine. But what the judge will know is that they'll see that as a distinct clash. They were like, okay, maybe prop wins the whole clash in this specific context, but opposition points out that not only is that the only specific context, and it's not necessarily totally clear that prop is outright winning and outright better in all those contexts, but they point out and bring the debate to all these other situations, all these other contexts, and they'll then be much more clear on evaluating the debate broadly, instead of two teams saying this is where the debate is taking place, no, this is where the debate is taking place. Especially with edges that aren't as good, it's very risky to just hope they buy your analysis as to why a certain country, a certain person, etc. looks a certain way. Always do try to engage with an even if, and making that a habit in your debating is a very, very good thing to do. The seventh thing, I think I've said this here and there as I've been doing this, but really, genuinely, stop repeating yourself. It's fine to emphasize ideas. It's fine to have an overarching theme in a lot of the argumentation that you're making. But the amount of time, honestly, the vast majority of time I spend adjudicating debates, watching debates, it is just people that in prep found one or two ideas they liked and they're just repeating them again and again and again. That team has an argument. You have one singular point of rebuttal. The opposition first speaker will use that point of rebuttal, the opposition second speaker, and the opposition third speaker. Throughout the debate, in all the time you have as a team to think of different bits of rebuttal, you won't come up with a single new one. You'll just use that one. And oftentimes it's a good rebuttal, it's fine. But do you want to only have one? Or even in your arguments, do you want to have one general broad idea that's somewhat persuasive, and you just want to beat the judge over the head with it again and again? So really record your speeches, listen to yourself, ask yourself how much of that time in my how much of the time in my 7 or 8 minute speech was I just constantly repeating myself? And if you can do that a bit less, I promise you'll get so much better. Because what you'll do is you'll hold yourself accountable and force yourself to think of new bits of analysis. And what I'll also add here is you actually don't always know what kind of analysis or arguments are going to be persuasive to an adjudicator. I've been in many situations where I had a kind of a throwaway argument or a throwaway bit of rebuttal that end up being very important in the outcome of the debate. And just because I was trying to force myself to think of new things, it helped in a surprising way. And actually the big thing that I thought, the whole case was resting on, the adjudicator was actually not at all impressed by it. So in general, it's really a good idea to try in your speeches to present as much new, interesting, unique content as possible. And I think that's what you'll find when you watch a lot of the highest level WSDC and WUDC debaters. In the time that they have, in the limited time they have to give their speech, they try and tell the judge and the audience and their opponents lots of different things to persuade them. They don't just find one thing that they think is kind of persuasive and just beat it to death. I would also say when it comes to strategy, I would always advise you as a debater, especially prop teams or whichever side you might be, if you're in a debate, let's say you're in a debate about euthanasia. Now you're sitting there thinking, what should the policy be? Should it be that these people at this stage of sickness, they should get these and these letters from a doctor and this and this and that? And what you end up doing is much of the most interesting arguments you can make in a euthanasia debate from proposition about the right to die and so on, you actually end up not being able to make because you concede that, oh, we shouldn't allow the average person to have access to these services, etc., etc. Now, I'm not saying that the hard stance is always better, but me personally, in most debates that I've been, if I want to get a high speaker score, if I want to have it be a high quality, good debate, what's really important is clarity. The worst debate you will ever be in, and the worst debate you've ever been in, is always when the proposition team is so scared of defending any harms that they define the policy or the debate in such a narrow scope, even if it is in their fiat to do so, that there's just not a lot of debate to be had. And there's not a lot of interesting ideas that they can even come up with because they agree with so much of what the opposition says. So, for example, if you're in a debate about nationalizing land, I really think the most interesting, most persuasive arguments come from a team that's willing to take a bit of a more radical stance. A team that comes up there and says we're going to do this super gradually and slowly and with the help of the private sector, etc., etc. Yes, you will probably be able to deal with a lot of the harms, but so many of the cool arguments you want to argue for, like the necessity of this, the principled importance of it, how this is finally a substantial level of justice given to people that have been disenfranchised through systems of apartheid and dispossession, all those things. The moment you go soft on the problem, you are implicitly conceding that whatever problem you're solving isn't that bad. So I'm not saying you must always go insane and in a euthanasia debate say, people should be able to walk into a pharmacy and buy a cyanide pill or whatever. But in general, honestly, if you're in a situation where you're struggling to come up with a smart enough policy, just make it as simple and as clear as possible, and then just let the debate happen. And I'll promise you, even if you lose, you'll definitely have much better speaker scores when you at least attempted to make these interesting, maybe not always intuitive arguments, than if you just try to make these very basic, vanilla, uncontroversial ideas and you present them to the rest of the audience. I mean, someone who stands up in a debate and talks about that we should give welfare to poor people. I mean, you can definitely do that. I'm sure you could give a good speech, but it's just not a very interesting argument because most people already agree with you. But if you stand up in a debate and you say we should nationalize all land and anyone who refuses to do it should be sent to jail, that debate immediately becomes much more interesting. So I would just have you think about that. And I can tell you, I've been in so many debates where there are so many more debates where I've screwed myself and my team over by trying this really, let me do this intelligent strategic reframing or definition of the debate, instead of just engaging with it simply and clearly and making the arguments and accepting the harms. So that is a general bit of advice I would give you. The ninth thing, which is obviously much less important than everything else that I've said, is try and work a little bit on your intros. What I mean to say by this is it's not just about sounding cool, but sometimes when you get to the podium for yourself psychologically, it's very important that you let the adjudicator know, that you let yourself know, that you let your opponents know. You are very confident in the ideas you're presenting. You feel strongly about what you're saying, and you have a consistent rhetorical line about why you are saying what you're saying. And so just a quick 10 or 20 seconds to involve and get the audience and the judge and the opponents invested in what you're saying is really, really valuable, especially because in as much as that's not going to win your debate, when I'm adjudicating and I hear someone say something very, very interesting in their intro, I'm a human being. I'm just more likely to be interested. I'm more likely to be listening a little bit more carefully in the first 1 or 2 minutes. What you must also know about adjudicators is they write down a lot more in the first 3 to 4 minutes of your speech than they write down in the last 3 to 4 minutes of your speech. Honestly, between minute 6 and 7, 7 and 8, those are definitely the parts of the speech that they're listening to the least, especially at the end of the debate. So on a psychological level, both for the adj and for yourself, it's a good idea to start working on just thinking about what sort of intro am I going to give at the start of my speech that is attention grabbing, but don't try and make it too cringe. And also don't say stuff like, oh, they talk about the vulnerable actor, the only vulnerable actor is their case, or lame stuff like that. Just make it pointed and about the specific thing that you're defending. The last thing, and this is now the least easy of all the tips that I've given you, but it's just shocking to me how few people that say they're serious about getting better at debating, that are willing to be a bit, I guess, like kind of be sweats about it, is to judge debates. I mean, when I was debating in high school and even in university, I could almost verbatim remember so many arguments and debates that I'd seen before, and it really helped me when I was debating. But I think if I really wanted to be good that time, I would have really spent a lot of time listening very carefully and making very careful note of specific arguments, high level arguments that I heard in certain debates, right? You hear someone make an argument about why it's not right for the state to infringe on people's liberty, even for the sake of the greater good. That argument is going to come in handy in almost every single debate you'll ever be in. So watch it, take note, try and remember it, try and understand it, right? Don't just get up there and repeat it. But if you can really understand the building blocks of it and listen to other speeches making a similar sort of point, you'll over time realize what the best version of these principled or practical arguments are, and you'll be much better at making them in debates. You'll also be much better at critiquing them in debates, because the debates that you watch, you will see these very high level debaters respond to those ideas. Oftentimes when you watch a WDC or WSDC debate, you listen to the prime minister speaking, the first speaker of proposition, and you just think, oh my word, what an absolutely fantastic case. I have no idea how I would respond to that. And you listen to the opposition first speaker and you're like, oh my word, opposition is 100% going to win this debate. And it goes back and forth like that. It's very instructive because it lets you realize, hey, I don't have to be as scared of these ideas, even if there's a really smart sounding person saying that, because there are responses to these ideas in each and every single debate. And I would also just say, it helps a lot in debating to know what's happening in the world, in terms of the news, in terms of history, in terms of very basic things, right? If you at least know a little bit about some of the social justice movements that have existed in the world, the most popular ones, it'll help you in debates. It'll help you come up with arguments. If you know a little bit about a couple of wars, a couple of the big wars that have happened, why they've happened, and so on, that'll help you a lot in debates. If you understand what's going on in the world around you, it will help you in debates. The amount of debaters that I meet, and this is, I guess, more specifically for high schoolers, but definitely also for people in university, the amount of people that just don't know anything. And honestly, I would be terrified to go into debate knowing as little as many people do. So genuinely judge debates. If you need to, memorize certain arguments and make sure you can present them very well. I mean, the amount of people that you run choice, you run the argument of the social contract, you've run it a million times and you've sucked at it a million times. You've never thought of just going and seeing how actually very smart, nerdier people than you have done it. No, you're just going to say it the same way over and over again for your entire debating career. I don't get it, right? You don't want to know anything that's happening in a debate. You go in a debate about militarily intervening in Sudan. You don't even know where Sudan is on a map, right? So that is my last bit of advice. I hope this has been useful. I do apologize if it's been a bit long. I've tried to keep it at least under 30 minutes, so hopefully that's not too much of a time investment for you guys, and I hope I've been able to justify and give you a little bit of, I hope I've been able to justify why these things are so useful, and I've here and there been able to give you some tips on how you can practically go about improving without doing all the most complex and frankly intimidating parts of getting better at debating.